When people think about the cost of divorce, they usually think about attorney's fees. Then they think about retainers, hourly rates, court costs, mediators, financial professionals, and perhaps the cost of establishing two households. Those expenses are real and they matter. But after many years of working with families going through divorce, I've learned that some of the most significant costs of divorce never appear on the attorney's invoice. They show up in lost sleep, missed work, strained parenting relationships, children caught between two parents, and months or sometimes years of life consumed by a conflict that took a life of its own. That is why I want to talk today about the real cost of divorce conflict. Conflict and disagreement are not the same thing. You can disagree about parenting time, the house, support, or finances without turning those disagreements into a war. Some disputes generally require legal intervention, and there are some circumstances where court involvement is necessary and appropriate. But there's also an enormous amount of divorce conflict that becomes more expensive, not because the underlying issue is impossible to solve, but because fear, anger, misinformation, poor communication, or the process itself causes the dispute to escalate. Welcome back to the Restorative Divorce Podcast. I'm Erin Birt, a family law attorney, mediator, and creator of the kitchen table divorce and restorative divorce approaches. Before we begin, I want you to know there are two ways I work with parents. I work individually with a parent who needs answers, legal guidance, and strategy for moving forward. I also work with parents together when both are ready to resolve their divorce through mediation. Both approaches are designed to give families structure, information, in a way that makes progress without simply waiting for a court system to determine the next step. If you're not sure which approach is appropriate for you, you can visit our website at birtlaw.com. You can also schedule a complimentary 15-minute introductory call with me to learn more about my services. Or if you're ready for a more substantive conversation before investing in additional legal services, we can spend 30 minutes together in a planning session. We can talk about who you are, where you are, what concerns you the most, and what options may be available for moving forward. The central idea I want you to remember from today's episode is this. The cost of divorce is not determined only by what you have to resolve. It is also determined by how you choose to resolve it. Two families can face very similar parenting and financial issues and have dramatically different experiences. One may spend months exchanging hostile communications, filing motions, preparing for hearings, and paying professionals to argue every disagreement. And another family may still have difficult issues to resolve, but with preparation, organization, professional guidance, and structured conversations, the family perhaps can make decisions and continue moving forward. The problems may be similar. The process, however, can be very different. So let's begin with the cost everybody can see. Money. Litigation is labor intensive. Every contested issue can require attorney conferences, written correspondence, pleadings, court appearances, document review, preparation, and follow-up. If financial information is incomplete or disputed, formal discovery may become necessary. If discovery itself becomes a source of conflict, attorneys may spend additional time exchanging correspondence or appearing in court. If parenting issues escalate, other professionals may become involved. If a case moves toward trial, preparation becomes even more extensive. None of these services are inherently unnecessary. There are cases in which they are absolutely required. The important distinction is between necessary legal work and conflict-generated legal work. If an attorney needs to spend an hour solving the underlying problem, that's one thing. If the same problem generates 5 additional hours because every email creates another argument and every request is interpreted as an attack or information is repeatedly withheld or delivered incompletely, the family's now paying for the conflict surrounding the problem as well as the problem itself. Consider something as ordinary as gathering financial documents. In almost every divorce, the parties need information about income, bank accounts, retirement assets, debts, real estate, and other financial matters. If both spouses gather the information, organize it, exchange it, identify what's missing, and ask meaningful questions, the professionals can focus their time on analyzing the information and help the family make decisions. But if documents arrive piecemeal, requests are ignored, assumptions are made about what the other spouse is hiding, and every missing statement becomes a source of suspicion, the same financial disclosure process becomes far more expensive. This is why Chapter 2 of my book, The Kitchen Table Divorce, is called A Well-Set Table. Before I ask families to negotiate or talk about anything, I ask them to prepare. They need to set guidelines for conversations. They need to schedule meetings. They need to choose a setting that encourages productive communication. Gather the bank accounts and investment statements, retirement information, tax returns, mortgage documents, and income information. The book is very deliberate about this because transparent and informed financial decisions become much easier when both people actually understand their financial situation. And that preparation isn't busy work, it's a cost control strategy. If you're paying an attorney, mediator, or financial professional to spend their time figuring out which documents are missing, reconstructing information, or repeatedly asking for records, you're using professional time for something you could have organized before the meeting. I'd much rather have you use the professional's expertise to analyze the information, identify your options, and help you make a decision. That's part of what I mean by setting the table. Prepare first, then use professional expertise where it actually adds value. Delay also has a financial cost. A divorce that takes longer may require more professional involvement, more correspondence, more status states, more time spent revisiting issues that people discussed perhaps months earlier. Meanwhile, families continue living with the financial uncertainty. They may be maintaining some temporary arrangements that no longer make sense and delaying decisions about a house or postponing their financial planning or carrying debt while waiting for a resolution. Now, sometimes delay is unavoidable, but delay caused by conflict is expensive in ways that extend well beyond the attorney's bill. The second cost is harder to calculate because it does not appear on a monthly statement. Divorce conflict consumes emotional bandwidth. People who are living in prolonged conflict often describe checking their phones constantly, rereading emails, anticipating the next accusation, replaying conversations in their minds, or lying awake thinking about what might happen next. They may be physically present at work or with their children, while mentally participating in an argument that has been going on for weeks. That kind of chronic stress changes the way people make decisions. When every communication feels threatening, even relatively ordinary questions can trigger a defensive response. A request to change a weekend becomes evidence that the other parent is unreasonable. A question about an account becomes an accusation of financial dishonesty. A delayed response becomes intentional disrespect. Once people begin interpreting every interaction through the lens of conflict, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish the actual issue from everything they now associate with it. This is also where divorce conflict begins affecting parenting. A parent who is emotionally exhausted has less patience. A parent who spends the evening drafting a response to an angry email is not fully present during homework or bedtime rituals. A parent who is constantly preparing for the next dispute may unintentionally talk about the divorce within earshot of the children, or ask questions that place the children in the middle. Again, these are not often bad parents. They are just overwhelmed parents operating in a system of conflict that is consuming too much of their attention. Children notice far more than adults sometimes realize. They notice facial expressions when the other parent's name is mentioned. They notice tension and exchanges. They notice when one parent sighs after reading a text message. They also notice when a school concert suddenly feels uncomfortable because both parents are in the same room. And when children sense that their parents are in conflict, they may begin adapting their own behavior to manage it. A child may stop talking about the fun weekend they had with dad because they're worried it will hurt mom's feelings. Another child may avoid telling dad that mom is taking them on vacation because they don't want to trigger an argument. Some children become extraordinarily careful about what they say in each household. They learn to read the emotional temperature of the room before talking about the other parent. And that is an enormous price for a child to pay. One of the ideas I return to throughout my book, The Kitchen Table Divorce, is that the legal divorce eventually ends, but the family continues. In the chapter called Setting the Table for the Future, I talk about what happens beyond the settlement itself. Open communication and mutual respect can reduce the emotional strain of conflict. Agreements created cooperatively may be easier to adjust as life changes. And perhaps most importantly for parents, the communication habits developed during divorce can become the foundation for the co-parenting relationship afterward. If you have children together, there will be school events and sporting events and birthdays and graduations and weddings and even perhaps grandchildren. Your relationship as spouses may end, but your connection as parents continues. That means the way you handle conflict during the divorce can influence family relationships long after the final judgment is entered and signed by the judge. This does not mean divorced parents have to become friends. That is not a realistic goal for every family, nor is it necessary. Successful co-parenting does not require Sunday dinners together or family vacations after divorce. What children need is something much more achievable. Parents who can communicate when necessary, exchange important information, respect reasonable boundaries, and allow their children to have a meaningful relationship without feeling caught between two competing sides. If conflict is so costly, why does escalation happen so easily? Usually it's because divorce involves some combination of fear, grief, uncertainty, anger, and a loss of control. A person who feels financially vulnerable may interpret every financial proposal as a threat. A parent who's terrified of losing time with a child may approach every parenting discussion as a battle. And someone who feels betrayed may want the legal process to acknowledge the hurt they experienced in the marriage. Friends and family may unintentionally intensify those fears by sharing stories from their own divorces or telling someone what they should demand. Misinformation can also be incredibly expensive. People come into divorce having read something online, heard what happened in a friend's case, or had been told by a relative that they are entitled to a certain particular outcome. They may begin negotiating around an assumption that is simply wrong. By the time accurate information enters the conversation, positions have already hardened. And now the professional is not only explaining the law or the options, the professional is also trying to unwind weeks of fear built around misinformation. This is why obtaining good information early can have an enormous impact on your divorce. You do not necessarily need to know every answer at the beginning of your divorce. You do need to understand what questions should be asked, what information should be gathered, what decisions actually need to be made, and which issues require professional guidance. Education creates that framework. It's a framework that gives people something more reliable than fear to use when making decisions. Structured communication matters for the same reason. Not every thought needs to become an email. Not every disagreement needs an immediate response. Not every issue belongs in the same conversation. Sometimes one of the most productive things parents can do is establish a process. Financial questions are gathered and discussed at a scheduled meeting, or parenting issues are addressed separately, or documents are exchanged through an agreed method, and emotionally charged subjects are not debated through dozens of text messages late at night. Mediation can also create structure when parents are able to participate safely and meaningfully. A mediator does not eliminate disagreement. The mediator creates a process of working through it. Instead of two people repeatedly having the same argument home, they have a defined agenda, identify information that's needed, discuss options, and work towards decisions. The goal is not to pretend conflict doesn't exist. The goal is to prevent the conflict from becoming the process. So I want to talk about a real example of what happens when you interrupt escalation. There's a client story in the Kitchen Table Divorce that illustrates this particularly well. I worked with a working mother who had 2 young children, and she and her husband were already doing something important. They had worked together on a parenting plan, and they had begun practicing a 50-50 parenting schedule. Her husband had filed for divorce, and his attorney, although well-intentioned, began moving quickly into formal court proceedings. For my client, the change was immediate. a family that had been making progress suddenly felt as though it was heading towards a much more expensive and adversarial process. She became anxious and uncertain, not necessarily because the issues themselves had changed, but because the process surrounding those issues had changed. She had hoped they could resolve their details without the expense and disruption of extensive court involvement. So we made a deliberate decision not to match escalation with escalation. I educated my client about the divorce process. I contacted her husband's attorney and explained that my client remained committed to resolving the divorce without unnecessary, costly legal process. We continued meeting regularly, and we kept the court informed about the progress being made. The judge could see that the divorce was moving in the right direction and allowed us the opportunity to continue resolving matters outside of court. Ultimately, we avoided discovery disputes, unnecessary hearings, and we avoided a trial. As I share in my book, our approach lowered her legal fees approximately 35% below the average uncontested court divorce costs that we reference. We worked with our client, her former spouse's attorney, and the judge to turn what could have become very contentious and expensive into a manageable resolution. I think that story illustrates something incredibly important. The issues did not magically disappear. We just changed how we approached the issues. And changing the process changed the cost. That's an important distinction because reducing conflict does not mean surrendering your interests. It doesn't mean agreeing to something that isn't appropriate simply to avoid an argument. It means asking whether the level of process surrounding the problem is actually necessary to solve the problem. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. There's another side to this conversation that I think is extremely important. Reducing the cost of divorce does not mean avoiding professional help. In fact, sometimes trying too hard to avoid professional guidance can also become extremely expensive. In the kitchen table divorce, I call this adding a chair at the table. Even couples who are communicating well can reach a point where they need professional expertise. There may be a legal issue they don't understand. There may be a complicated financial question. They may have reached an impasse that they can't resolve on their own. Or they may simply need someone to review what they've done already and identify what is missing. Or they just might need help with a complicated court process. My book specifically encourages professional involvement at those key moments because the right assistance can save time, reduce stress, and avoid delays, and prevent missteps. So the question isn't, how do I avoid paying anyone? How do I avoid having an attorney? The better question, I think, is, who needs a chair at this table and when? Maybe you need an attorney to answer a legal question. Maybe you need a financial professional to analyze a complicated asset. Maybe you need a mediator because you and your spouse keep having the same conversation without reaching a decision. Maybe you need a planning session to identify what you don't know before you make an important decision. Paying the right professional for an hour to answer the right question can be far less expensive than spending months fighting about something neither spouse fully understands. That's also why my kitchen table divorce planning session is structured around identifying gaps, answering questions, determining when another professional may be useful, and creating a plan for what happens next. The objective is not to insert professionals into every aspect of your divorce. It's to use professional expertise intentionally when it adds value. My book identifies some of the benefits of that structure very practically. Clearer steps, better organization, less uncertainty, and fewer delays caused by missing or incomplete information. I sometimes tell clients that every dollar spent on unnecessary conflict is a dollar that cannot be used somewhere else. It cannot go toward a child's college account. It can't help establish a second household. It can't remain invested for retirement, or it can't pay for a family vacation or therapy or tutoring or 1,000 other things that families need as they rebuild their lives after divorce. And the same is true of time. Every hour spent fighting about an issue that could have been resolved through a structured conversation is an hour you don't get back. Divorce already asks families to make enormous adjustments. The process should not consume more of your family's life than is reasonably necessary to make informed and durable decisions. And what are you actually trying to preserve? This brings us back to the larger vision behind the kitchen table divorce and the restorative divorce approaches. The goal is not simply to achieve a cheaper divorce. Cost matters, but cheap is not the objective. The objective is to use your family's resources intentionally. Sometimes spending money on the right professional at the right moment saves enormous amounts of money later. Sometimes a financial professional can answer a question that spouses have argued about for months and can provide that to your legal counsel to use in your settlement agreements. Sometimes a planning session with an attorney can identify the legal issues before someone takes an unnecessary step or an unexpected step like filing for divorce without any answers. Sometimes mediation provides the structure parents need to finally make decisions. So the question should not be, how little can I spend on my divorce? I think a much better question is, what do I want my resources to accomplish? Do you want to spend money repeatedly arguing about the same problem, or do you want to spend it obtaining the information needed to solve that problem? Do you want your emotional energy consumed by proving that your former spouse is wrong, or do you want to use that energy building the next stage of your life? Do you want your children remembering the years surrounding the divorce as a period when they had to manage their parents' conflict, or as a difficult transition their parents worked hard to keep from becoming their burden? The conclusion of the Kitchen Table Divorce book describes a well-set table as one built on transparency and a focus on everybody's best interests, particularly when children are involved. The objective is to create an equitable agreement while also managing the costs of getting there, and ultimately to reach a resolution that recognizes the family's shared history while allowing each person to move forward. And that is the bigger conversation. It's the bigger cost conversation. Imagine yourself 2 years after your divorce. The legal case is over. Your finances have settled into a new normal. Your children understand their schedules. You and your former spouse are not necessarily friends, but you can exchange information about a doctor's appointment without starting an argument. You can both attend a school event without your child worrying about where everybody will sit. When something unexpected happens, you have a process for addressing it. Divorce is no longer the organizing force in your family's life. That is the dream that I want families to keep in mind. Not a conflict-free divorce, not a perfect former spouse, not an agreement where you've received everything you've wanted, but a life in which the divorce eventually becomes something that happened rather than something you're still living every day. The decisions you make during the process can move you toward or away from that future. Organization can move you toward it. Accurate information can move you toward it. Thoughtful, professional guidance can also move you toward it. Structured communication can also move you toward it. And perhaps most importantly, remembering what you are actually trying to preserve can move you toward that future. Because the assets you are protecting during the divorce are not limited to the house, retirement accounts, or bank balances. You're also protecting your time, your ability to parent, your children's sense of security, your financial resources, your capacity to restore and rebuild. And where possible, enough of the parenting relationship that your child can continue loving both of you without carrying the weight of your divorce. Sometimes the most expensive part of divorce is not the legal process itself. It is what unnecessary conflict takes from the family along the way. Thank you for joining me for episode 6 of the Restorative Divorce Podcast. If today's episode made you realize that your divorce may need a different structure, remember, there's 2 ways I can work with you. I work with you individually if you need legal guidance or a strategy for moving forward. But I can also work with parents together through mediation when both are ready to work towards agreements and reduce unnecessary court involvement. If you're unsure where to begin, visit birtlaw.com, schedule a complimentary 15-minute call with me. And if you're ready to spend more time understanding your circumstances and your options, maybe you would like a 30-minute planning session. During that session, we'd identify what actually is creating the conflict, what information you may need, where professional guidance could add value, and what path may allow you to move forward more efficiently. You do not have to agree about everything to reduce the cost of conflict. You need enough structure to identify the issues, enough information to make informed decisions, and enough focus on resolution to keep the divorce from consuming resources your family will need on the other side of the divorce. So set the table, gather the information, and when you need expertise and the right chair at the right time, reach out. Because ultimately, the goal is not simply to get divorced. The goal is to still have a life, a family, and a future worth investing in when the divorce is over.